Welcome to The Explainer. Today we are diving into a really big idea, one that tries to answer one of the most fundamental questions out there. I mean, think about it. You've got everything from small hunter-gatherer groups to massive, sprawling industrial states. How do we even begin to explain that incredible diversity? Well, that's where a powerful set of theories called neo-evolutionism comes into play. It's a framework for understanding how and why cultures change over time.
Okay, so first, a little backstory. The original idea way back in the 19th century was something called classical evolutionism. And honestly, it was pretty problematic. It tried to rank all societies on this single ladder of progress, often using some really biased judgments. But then, in the 20th century, a new wave of thinkers basically rebooted the whole concept. They threw out the old assumptions and said, let's stick to the facts, to hard, measurable, quantifiable data.
So this new, more scientific approach, neo-evolutionism, kicked off with a really ambitious goal. They wanted to find the universal laws that govern all cultural change, kind of like finding the laws of physics, but for human society.
And a key figure leading this charge was an anthropologist named Leslie White. He came up with this formula that looks super simple, but the idea behind it is incredibly powerful. His big idea was that culture, when you boil it all down, is fundamentally a system for capturing and using energy.
So let's break that down. The E is for energy. And this is the really important part. He wasn't just talking about electricity or something. No, for White, E was everything. It was human muscle power, the power of domesticated animals, wind, water, fossil fuels, you name it. The more energy a society could harness per person, the more complex its culture could become.
Right, but energy by itself isn't the whole picture. That's where the T comes in. T is for technology, and it's all about the efficiency of the tools you're using. I mean, a water wheel is way more efficient than a person carrying buckets, right? And an oil rig blows a water wheel completely out of the water. So as your technology improves, you can get way more out of your energy sources, and that's what really drives development forward.
Another thinker, the archaeologist V. Gordon Childe, had a similar big-picture view. He saw human history as basically a series of three massive game-changing revolutions. First, you get the invention of agriculture, the Neolithic Revolution. That creates food surpluses, which then makes the second revolution possible, urbanization, the birth of cities. And finally, boom, the Industrial Revolution hits, scaling up energy use like never before and changing everything all over again.
Okay, but this whole idea of a single universal path for everybody, it didn't sit right with everyone. Critics were like, hang on, what about the huge differences between cultures? What about their environments? And this leads us to a really important counter-argument that totally shifted the conversation.
This is where Julian Stewart comes into the picture. He proposed a theory he called multilinear evolution. He basically said, look, it's not one big highway of progress. It's more like a whole network of different roads. And what determines which road a society takes? The environment. A culture that develops in the Arctic is going to evolve very differently from one in a tropical rainforest. The specific environment is key.
And this idea was so powerful, it actually kicked off a whole new field, cultural ecology. It's pretty much what it sounds like, the study of how human culture is an adaptation to the environment. The central idea is that our cultural practices, from how we get our food to how we organize our families, are all shaped by the very practical problems of surviving in a particular place. And this quote from Stewart just nails his whole philosophy. He's saying, yeah, maybe we lose that one-size-fits-all universal law, but what we get in return is so much better. A real, concrete, and specific understanding of why individual cultures are the way they are.
All right, so now we've got these two big ideas on the table, the universal and the specific. So what happened next? Well, later thinkers tried to bring these ideas together to solve some real-world cultural mysteries.
So how can both be true? How can we have universal patterns and all these unique specific paths? Well, a couple of anthropologists, Marshall Salins and Elman Service, came up with a really elegant way to think about it. They used the analogy of a tree.
Picture this. The trunk of the tree is what they called general evolution. These are the huge game-changing shifts that affect pretty much all of humanity, like the invention of agriculture. But then you have the branches. The branches represent specific evolution. That's all the different ways individual cultures branch off and adapt to their own local environments, which is how you get incredible unique adaptations, like Inuit cultures developing to thrive in the Arctic.
This synthesis of ideas really set the stage for Marvin Harris and his hugely influential theory of cultural materialism. Harris essentially argued that the material conditions of life, the infrastructure of a society, meaning its environment, its technology, and its economy, are the foundation that determines everything else, from its social structure to its belief systems.
So that sounds good in theory, but how does it actually work in practice? Let's take a famous cultural puzzle, the Hindu religious taboo against eating beef. A cultural materialist isn't going to start by looking at religion.
Nope. They're going to start by looking at the material conditions on the ground. Harris argued that in the Indian agricultural system, a living cow is just worth way, way more than a dead one. They are the tractors, they're essential for plowing fields, their dung is a critical source of fuel and fertilizer, and they provide milk. So from this perspective, the sacred taboo isn't irrational at all. It's a brilliant, practical cultural adaptation that protects a vital economic resource from being eaten, especially in times of hunger.
Okay, let's try another one. Let's apply that same exact logic to another famous food taboo, the prohibition against eating pork in Judaism and Islam.
Again, Harris looked to the environment. And it turns out pigs are just not a good fit for an arid climate. They need a ton of water and shade. And they eat the same stuff humans do, like grain. They compete for scarce resources. So for ancient societies in the Middle East, trying to raise pigs on a large scale was just a bad ecological and economic strategy. The religious prohibition, therefore, acts as a cultural rule that reinforces what is a really sound ecological practice.
Now these explanations are pretty compelling, right? But, and this is a big but, it is crucial to remember that no single theory explains everything. Neo-evolutionism and cultural materialism have definitely faced their fair share of criticism.
So what do the critics say? Well, for one, they argue that these theories can lead to environmental determinism, the idea that the environment dictates everything, which can really oversimplify the complexities of culture. They can also downplay the huge roles that things like politics, history, and individual choices play. And there's always a risk that these frameworks can subtly judge other cultures by Western standards of progress. So where does that leave us? Here's the key takeaway. Even if it's not the whole story, neo-evolutionism provides a powerful lens. It forces us to look for the practical, material reasons behind cultural practices that might otherwise seem strange or irrational. It connects our beliefs right back to the concrete realities of survival.
This chart visualizes that core idea perfectly. Cultural materialism sees society as having three levels. At the bottom, the biggest and most influential layer is the infrastructure. That's the material world. This foundation shapes the social and political structure above it, which in turn supports the superstructure of beliefs, ideology, and art. The whole point is, to understand the top, you have to start at the bottom.
And that leaves us with a final provocative thought to consider. If a sacred cow can actually be an economic strategy in disguise, what parts of our own modern culture, our own deepest beliefs, are really just clever, practical responses to the material world we inhabit, hidden in plain sight?